All right. Hello, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are tuning in from. My name is Julia Esakoff. I am Dr. Celia Chari's co-host for this month's Art, Archaeology, and Conservation Sciences Division Material Science Pioneers in Art and Archaeology webinar series. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few announcements. First, just a reminder to register for our symposium at MS&T this fall. The conference will be taking place from October 4th through 7th in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and the deadline for abstracts is coming up on May 1st this year as well. I would also like to share the opportunity for graduate students who would like to become members of ACerS. The AACS division will be covering the membership fee through the graduate and doctoral student membership. And finally, I would like to congratulate Heather Leckman, who has accepted the Anna O. Sheffer Award for 2026. And with that being said, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Sarah Grabowski. Sarah is an archaeological scientist and holds a Bachelor of Science in Optical Engineering from the University of Rochester and a Master's in Science and Archaeological Science from University College in London, where she explored pottery traditions of the Neolithic site of Solin in modern-day Croatia. Sarah is currently pursuing her PhD at the University of Cambridge, where she examines early Egyptian metallurgical practices through the study of copper funerary objects at the British Museum. Today, she'll be talking about her work on the experimental insights into Byzantine lead-tin yellow synthesis from her recent position as a graduate intern at the Getty Conservation Institute. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Julia. And I'd also like to say a quick thank you to Celia Chari and Vicki Evans for organizing the series and for the invitation to share some of my research. As Julia said, I am currently a PhD student, but today I'm not going to be talking about that research. I'll be talking about the research I did in my recent position as a graduate intern at the Getty Conservation Institute. So to start, we're going to give you a little bit of let's make sure I can advance. Great. Okay, so to start, we're going to talk a little bit about what is lead-tin yellow, how it was used historically, why this term really refers to two distinct materials, and why that matters. And then we're going to dig a little bit more into the history and connect it to a longer tradition of colored glass. And then finally, we're going to turn to how experiments, both ours and those of other research, have helped understand how and why these pigments were made, testing hypotheses about pigment manufacture, workshop practice, and the technological link with the vitreous materials of antiquity. And together, these perspectives, hopefully by the end, we'll be thinking about lead-tin yellow not as just an isolated pigment, but as a part of a much older, interconnected tradition of people manipulating lead-tin silicate materials to control color and opacity. We're going to talk a little bit about yellow. So yellow is a very sought-after color in human material culture since prehistory. And this is a timeline of just some of the pigments that were important in European art. It's a little bit misleading because you can see it on the left, it just trails off into antiquity. That continued on for several thousand years. But it's not an overstatement to say that people have been looking for a yellow pigment since people started making art. It's rooted in prehistory with materials that were naturally available, like ochre or orpiment, through to the rise of these synthetic pigments. Now this timeline it's incomplete. It's not exhaustive. There are synthetic yellows like Maya yellow that was made in the first millennium CE, but wasn't available to the Europeans. There are other yellow pigments, but this is just a sampler to give you, kind of ground you in the art historical context. And it's also incomplete because it considers these materials only as pigments, ground particles suspended in a binder to be painted onto a substrate. A distinction which will come up later, and I've kind of spoiled in the introduction a little bit already. So when we talk about the yellows of European art, there are a few that generally come to mind readily. Orpiment is one. It is a naturally occurring arsenic sulfide mineral. It was very widely used in antiquity, starting with the ancient Egyptians, because it's such a bright lemon to golden yellow color. And it was so vibrant that it was used in the place of gold leaf in the illuminations for this manuscript, the Book of Kells. But even though it's a really nice and bright, vibrant pigment, it's quite unstable, and it reacts especially with lead-based pigments. So if you use it with a lead white, you'll get these lead sulfides, these black lead sulfides forming on the surface. It kind of tempers, how if you're looking for a really bright, colorful pigment, you don't want it darkening over time. So it's not a perfect pigment. Another one that was very commonly used, and maybe you have a vision of it, is Naples yellow. It was a synthetic lead antimonate yellow. It has this warmer, almost like creamy color, if that makes sense. You see it a lot in paintings from like 1600 on. And I consider it a little bit of a rival to lead tin yellow for reasons that will come apparent, but Naples yellow will come back up several times in this talk. Because it is quite opaque, but it doesn't have the vibrance of lead tin yellow, or of some of the more modern synthetic counterparts like chrome yellow or cadmium yellow, which have this really bright, high chroma yellow, characteristic of the like 19th to 20th century artists. Yeah, these are just a few yellow pigments. And we don't have the time to get into the complete history of yellow, but perhaps less well known than some of these that maybe you have or haven't heard of is lead tin yellow. And what is a little bit less widely known, it was an absolute staple in the painter's palette during the Renaissance. And it's most well known for its use in European paintings from the 15th to 17th centuries, by the likes of Rembrandt and Vermeer, Rubens. And you can see it here really nicely in this detail from this painting. We have these thickly applied strokes of this opaque yellow paint. And for a while, it was thought to have originated in like 14th century Venice or Florence, but we see that it actually first appears in the late medieval period in illuminated manuscripts, starting from 12th century Constantinople. It's quite often found in panel paintings from the 13th to 14th century. Those particularly come from German-speaking regions. This particular manuscript is a little bit later. I chose it because it shows it really nicely. A lot of the really early uses of lead tin yellow was in mixtures or as a base layer to really make gold pop, because it is a really nice opaque pigment. And it was very versatile. It didn't fade. It, like the organic yellows, it didn't darken like orpiment does. But after its like heyday in the 15th century, it starts to decline, and there's a shift towards using Naples yellow or some of those other synthetic yellows. And by about 1750, it pretty much has vanished from a painter's palette. And it was so completely forgotten that like people just misidentified it as a variant of Naples yellow for a long time. And it wasn't until 1941 that it was rediscovered. So what is lead tin yellow? It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a lead tin oxide. Historically, there are two distinct materials that fall under this umbrella, very creatively called type 1 and type 2, a distinction that's formalized in the 1960s. Lead tin yellow type 1 is just a lead tin oxide, or lead stannate. It's represented by the chemical formula Pb₂SnO₄. It crystallizes in an orthorhombic structure, giving it pretty predictable diffraction behavior, and making it quite readily identifiable through techniques like XRD or Raman spectroscopy. From a practical standpoint, for an artist, you get this light lemon yellow pigment. It's matte, it's opaque, it's really light fast. Type 2 is compositionally a little more complex, not much. And here you get silica incorporated into that lead stannate structure, disrupting that long range order of the crystal lattice. And it produces a partially vitreous microstructure. As a result, this pigment tends to be a deeper, warmer yellow, though the precise colors of the pigments vary quite a bit depending on how it was manufactured. And because of the presence of that vitreous phase, it is a little bit more translucent when you use it as a paint. If you have loose powder like this, you can identify them pretty readily under the microscope. Lead tin yellow type 1 kind of looks like every other yellow pigment, but type 2 is quite distinct with these much larger, angular, translucent grains that looks like a crushed vitreous material. So the names despite the names that might imply a chronological sequence, type 2 is actually the earlier of the two materials. It appears in artworks from the 12th to 13th centuries, where type 1 really becomes widespread starting in the 15th century onward. We will discuss one very notable exception to this timeline in a moment, but this chronology is still being refined. And then it stops being used around 1750, and people tend towards using Naples yellow or just more yellow materials become available. Historically, it was actually quite difficult to identify lead tin yellow. Before it was recognized in 1941, if there was a yellow pigment and it had lead, it was just kind of indiscriminately defined as Naples yellow, or massicot, which is a lead monoxide, one of the two forms of lead monoxide at room temperature. It is yellow. It's not very stable. It tends to transform into litharge and go orange. It's not really a very good yellow pigment. So it wasn't really used as a pigment in antiquity. So the people just, if they didn't know to look for lead in tin, they didn't know they were looking for lead tin as a pigment at all. But with the introduction of techniques like X-ray diffraction, researchers have been able to reclassify many Naples yellow samples correctly as lead tin yellow. And it has rather far-reaching implications in art history because it quickly became clear that lead tin yellow isn't this like marginal or rare pigment, but rather it's a mainstream material that had just been forgotten. Even in today's labs, it's not trivial to distinguish between the two types, especially if you're trying to do it without removing a sample from the painting. I put the compositions up on the screen because you might think that you measure the lead tin ratio or the silica content, and that might be diagnostic for your pigment. But in reality, paintings are messy. There are layers, pigments are mixed, and the contamination of signal from neighboring layers, especially if it's used with something like lead white, makes these ratios pretty unreliable if you're really trying to distinguish between these two types of pigment. And it's for this reason that we rely on structural information by using techniques like XRD or Raman spectroscopy, rather than elemental information to differentiate between these two types. And these are the Raman spectra for these two materials. Lead tin yellow has a really strong peak at 129 wave numbers and a secondary peak at 196. While lead tin yellow type 2 is shifted, that main peak is shifted by about 10 wave numbers. Because of this disruption in the long range order of the material. And the precise peak position for type 2 varies a little bit, has been reported at a couple different places, consistent with the variability in the structure and the content of this compound. So there's gonna be a lot of type 1, type 2 in this talk, so bear with me. The most important thing to know is that they're different and that type 2 has silica and a different structure. So if we go back to this timeline for a moment, the conventional understanding is that type 2 dominates medieval practice, while type 1 becomes standardized a little bit later in Renaissance workshops. But the data sets are still small. If technical studies are done and lead and tin are detected, a lot of publications might either just will say lead tin yellow and not specify a type, or they will assign it based on the assumed chronology. So there's a little bit of circular logic that goes into how the type 1 and type 2 is reported. So this timeline is not perfect, but this is just where we start, right? So lead tin yellow is a pigment that just sort of appeared in medieval art. And so a natural question is, where were painters and illuminators getting this material? Well, we'll take the silica content of lead tin yellow type 2 as a clue, because if we step back from thinking strictly about this material in terms of a pigment, in the context of paintings or manuscripts, it soon becomes clear that lead stannate has a much longer tradition of use as a colorant than its use as a pigment would suggest. And yeah, the presence of silica is a key factor that ties it to the glassy materials of antiquity. And in fact, both lead stannate and lead antimonate, which is a compound that forms the pigment Naples yellow, were used to color yellow glass well before it appears as a pigment. A little bit more history. I am an archaeologist. So yellow is a really tricky color to make in high temperature materials. Yeah, blues and grays show like they arise quite easily, a little too easily if you're trying to make a clear glass from the transition irons like copper or iron that dissolve, substituting into the glass network. By contrast, if you're trying to get this strong opaque yellow, you need something with small particles with a high refractive index to absorb and then scatter the light. And there are two ways that people achieve this in antiquity. First, this is a picture of a yellow glass colored by lead antimonate. And underneath it is an SEM image where the bright spots are lead-bearing phases. So those are the lead antimonate crystals dispersed through the glassy matrix. And I'm talking about lead antimonate because this is the first of the two ways that ancient people were making opaque yellow glass. I know this is about lead tin yellow, but it is related. So in these early materials, yeah, antimony is used as the opacifying material. You get calcium antimonate for the white, like on this Egyptian fish vessel, and then the yellow stripes are lead antimonate. And yeah, it was used since around 1500 BC in ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. Antimony is a multivalent material. In glass, it primarily exists as Sb3+ and 5+. In an oxidizing melt, it tends to go towards a 5+ state, favoring the formation of calcium antimonate and lead antimonate, if calcium and lead are present, as opacifying crystals. But in a small amount, it can also act as a decolorizer to help the Roman, kind of the blue-green Roman transparent glass go to be properly colorless, which I just think is kind of neat. But tin also shows similar redox behavior. It was widely used as an opacifier, but starting a little bit later with the Romans, it was used first to make opaque white glass. Siderite precipitates in the melt the same way that calcium antimonate can. And you get this fine distribution of white particles. And then a little bit later, it shows up in glazes on ceramics. And then we get lead stannate to make the yellow, like the tesserae on the right. And the microstructure often shows sort of angular, discrete opacifier grains, and they're pretty heterogeneously distributed. On the bottom right is an SEM image of this tessera. And again, the bright regions are the lead-bearing regions, and you can see just how streaky it is, right? It doesn't look very well mixed. And that's because the people making this glass made a lead tin yellow colorant, crushed it, and then added it to the glass melt and mixed it in. Because theoretically, lead-stannate can form in situ in the glass melt, like siderite, but it requires unrealistically narrow furnace control. And at higher temperatures, the particles tend to decompose. The lead dissolves into your silicon matrix, and then the tin very happily makes some cassiterite, and it's very stable, but you've lost your yellow. You're left with this opaque white glass. And the issue when you're working with glass is that excess silica encourages this, and there's a lot of silica in glass. So to get around this, you make a glass with a relatively low silica content relative to the amount of lead-stannate. You crush that and you add it back into your base glass at a relatively low temperature and mix it in because it doesn't need to be exposed to such high temperatures. And this process is kind of the crux of our investigation to the origin of this pigment, and we will circle back to it at the end. Oh, and this is just to say that this transition to lead-stannate as a yellow glass is thought of as a late Roman shift, but it does appear even earlier in isolated occurrences, such as these beads from Iron Age Anatolia, so present-day Turkey, in the 5th to 7th centuries BCE. So both lead-stannate and lead-antimonate were being used for a very long time. And together, this kind of sets the stage for understanding why lead-tin yellow pigments, especially type 2, the silica-bearing phase, or silica-bearing type, are best understood as a transfer of knowledge from glassworkers to the painter's palette, rather than an invention of a painting studio. So this begs the question, how were they making it, right? And we do have some record about how lead-tin yellow pigment was being produced in the 15th century, because lead-tin yellow is a synthetic pigment. It doesn't, this lead-stannate phase does not exist in nature in a usable mineral. So if you're making either lead-tin yellow or type 1 or 2, you need a deliberate high temperature synthesis. So our earliest textual evidence is relatively late in the grand scheme of things. It comes from 15th century Italian sources. But these texts broadly agree that you mix lead and tin compounds, or yes, you mix lead and tin oxides, and you roast it at a high temperature, and then you grind the resulting material to use it as a pigment. Now these recipes, they give you ingredients, they give you amounts, but there is no indication of firing time or temperature or furnace conditions, anything like that. So there have been quite a few experiments starting from these recipes and making lead-tin yellow by firing, lead monoxide or minium and cassiterite. And we're just going to touch on a few of the big takeaways from these. First of which, and perhaps obvious, the ratios are important. This shows you there's a bar chart on the bottom that shows the amount of tin relative to the amount of the lead oxide. And if you add too much tin, too much cassiterite, your product tends to go white. You get a very pale final product. Whether your lead source is lead monoxide or minium doesn't really matter, unless you start with minium and you add way too much, in which case your result will be quite red, because minium is also known as red lead for a reason. And because these studies were about pigments, the results focused a lot on the color of these resulting materials, and less about the compounds that were present. Now, this earliest recipe book also contains what is cited as the earliest explicit recipe for lead-tin yellow type 2, where you take the product from the previous recipe, type 1, and you fire it again with silica and maybe a little bit more minium to make lead-tin yellow type 2. And this has been a little bit less studied, and the results similarly focused on the color of the product rather than the phases present. And nearly all of them started from a pre-made lead-tin yellow type 1 in line with the Renaissance recipes. But there are studies that show that you can make it in a single step synthesis from lead oxide, tin oxide, and silica. And while that study focused on the phase transformation rather than the actual reaction conditions, they did show that lead-tin yellow type 2 starts to form at a lower temperature when you start from the 3 separate reagents than if you were to make lead-tin yellow first and then fire with silica. And this raises a couple questions because if you can just make it in one step, why don't you? And if you can make it at a lower temperature in that one step, because fuel is historically the most expensive part of making glass. So this two-step method doesn't feel very economical for your fuel use. And again, pretty much all of this is rooted in those 15th century recipes. But we have no textual evidence for how lead-tin yellow was being manufactured before this. What we do have is an object that predates this by centuries. This is a Byzantine manuscript from 1133 Constantinople. And while this manuscript was at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, some colleagues of mine studied the pigments present with Raman spectroscopy. And what they found was a combination of type 1 and type 2 that didn't seem like that couldn't be attributed to 2 different layers. This is the Raman spectrum or spectra that they got. The top one in yellow aligns quite well to lead-tin yellow type 1 with the peaks at those where the yellow dashed lines are. And the spectrum on the bottom corresponds quite well to type 2 with that orange dashed line at the peak at 137, 138 wave numbers. And the spectra in the middle in white look like mixtures of these signatures. And all of this comes from a very small area on the manuscript. And this is notable not only because it represents the earliest use of either of these pigments, I think, but also because it's one of the very few times that the 2 types have been reported together on an object. So given that in this instance, the earliest recorded use of these as a pigment, both types appear together, could this mixed type lead-tin yellow provide insight into how this pigment was being produced? Does this mixture naturally arise from certain firing conditions for that single step synthesis, or does it indicate a production sequence that does necessitate that you make type 1 first, in line with those Renaissance recipes that we discussed earlier? This brings us to the experimental work. To investigate this, we made some pigment. We did 2 rounds of experiments. First trying to make type 2 directly from separate oxide components, and then making type 2 from type 1. And this work, as I said, was done while I was at the Getty Conservation Institute, and it was in collaboration with Kathy Faber and her team at Caltech to do the firings and the furnaces in their lab. And then the samples were brought back to the Getty for Raman analysis. And I will clarify that these are initial experiments. The aim was not to reproduce the historical pigments exactly. We were working from analytically pure materials. We were using a modern furnace. And the goal was really to understand which pathways are likely to result in this mixed type process and lay the groundwork for some future research. So the first question is, how do we make lead-tin yellow type 2 from lead oxide, tin oxide, and silica in a single step? And we prepared a couple different mixtures, 2 different ratios of lead to tin oxide, and then fired them with no, low, medium, and high silica at a couple different temperatures. And these are the products that we made. Across the top are bar charts that are just there to visualize the ratio of the components for all of the samples in that column. And you can't see a lot of the color difference. It's not perfect comparing across these photomicrographs. But I'll just tell you the answer. These lower temperature ones are mostly lead oxide. So temperature was too low, mostly it remained unreacted. And then the samples with no silica or low silica made lead tin yellow type 1, which is what we expected. And then the remaining mixtures, we did make lead tin yellow type 2. So if we take a look at two of these samples a little bit more closely, these samples only vary in the amount of silica, so they're fired the same and the same lead to tin ratio. One has high silica, one has low silica. And we take a look at the Raman spectra for these samples. The sample with low silica has lead tin yellow type 1. It has some unreacted lead oxide, but no lead tin yellow type 2 until we add a little bit more silica, and then we get samples that are overwhelmed by lead tin yellow type 2. So you can make lead tin yellow type 2 in a one-step process. You don't need to make type 2 first or type 1 first. But most significant here is that none of the conditions that we tested resulted in a mixture of the two types. So what this is consistent with that requirement of silica to promote the structural change from type 1 to type 2. We don't see PbSnO₃ forming in the absence of silica. And then when you add silica, type 2 just takes over. And a slight aside, and I wish I had a better photo of this, but there's screw crucibles on the right, with the same firing conditions, same lead to tin ratio, and they only vary in the amount of silica. The one on the top has less silica, and the one on the bottom has quite a bit more. And the sample on the bottom, I mean, these are, I want to say they're fresh out of the furnace, but they had cooled. The one on the bottom, you can see that with all of that silica, the sample melted and formed mostly this white glassy material with the lead tin yellow persisting in these little pockets. So the high silica content made the lead tin yellow type 2 start to break down, leaving cassiterite, which is just more stable at these high temperatures, and the lead is dissolved into that silica matrix. The temperature sensitivity of this color is pretty well known. This picture comes from a study on lead antimonite glass, which, as we've discussed, is analogous to lead stannate in many ways. These samples have a silica content closer to a traditional glass, somewhere like 60–70% silica, and were fired a little bit over 1,000 degrees Celsius. But you can see that I really like this because it shows just how much the color degrades in a matter of minutes. So time and temperature certainly have an effect on the stability of the color, but so does an excess of silica, which is kind of unavoidable when you're making a glass. So that was a bit of a side note. But during this experiment, we didn't identify any conditions that produced the mixed type of lead tin yellow that we were looking for. When type 2 forms, it dominates, and when the conditions favor lead tin yellow type 1, no lead tin yellow type 2 was forming. So the next option is that you do make lead tin yellow type 1 first, you mix it with silica and fire it again, following that Renaissance model. So we did just that. We made mixtures of pre-made type 1, added silica, fired it for various lengths of time at 2 different temperatures. And we found that the samples that were fired at 650 degrees Celsius, again, largely too low of a temperature. It is predominantly lead tin yellow type 1, but we do see that at certain points, like there are crystals of type 2 starting to form. And then with the higher temperature, if you add too much silica, your type 2 is degrading. That Esakoff, that lead oxide is from the lead that has dissolved into the silica matrix. And the type 2 peak is so low because all of your colorant has decomposed into lead oxide and cassiterite. If you add a little less silica, you get a really nice peak at 138 wave numbers, corresponding to lead tin yellow type 2. And then with a little less silica, here's where we start to see that mixture of the signatures of the two types. And this starting to look a little bit like the analytical results from the manuscript. So what this showed was that lead tin yellow type 2 can be made directly from the oxides, but the conditions that we tested did not result in a mixed phase product. And that a mixture of lead-tin yellow type 1 and type 2 is more readily produced when type 1 is synthesized ahead of time. Now, this is not particularly surprising because type 1 can just persist unreacted into the final product, but this is notable because it might imply the intentional production of lead-tin yellow type 1, at least as an intermediate product, well before its appearance as a pigment in its own right. So the takeaways from this are that if type 1 is appearing as an intermediate product centuries earlier than previously assumed, then its absence in early artworks may reflect the limited resolution of previous analytical studies, and puts this timeline that we discussed earlier kind of up in the air. And it does support the technological continuity with traditions in glassmaking. Now, we're not the first ones to suggest that lead-tin yellow is linked to glass. It's interesting to think about, to go beyond that statement and think about how these craft spheres interacted. Because yeah, the structural similarity of lead-tin yellow type 2 and the silica-bearing glass phases found in ancient glasses naturally points towards the glass industry. And hopefully I have made clear by this point that lead stannate and lead antimonate yellows were produced as colorant for vitreous materials long before they entered the painter's palette as pigments. But to think a little bit more about how this overlap might occur, we're going to walk through the historical production sequence of yellow glass. So the first step is to make your lead stannate, probably by roasting lead and tin metal together. In terms of glass making, this product is called a calx, but it is chemically identical to lead-tin yellow type 1. It's a crystalline Pb₂SnO₄ compound. They just use different terminology. And then if you fire this calx with a small amount of sand, you get this colorant-dense vitreous material called an anime. It has a very high ratio of colorant to silica, and it's not workable as a glass in and of itself, but it is very yellow. So you take this, crush it together, and you mix it into a molten base glass to get your final colored yellow glass. Due to the silica-rich base melt that you're mixing it into, the lead stannate would presumably all convert to type 2. And XRD studies of yellow glass do report lead stannate in this form, in this type 2 form. There needs to be a little bit more research to see if any type 1 can persist into the final glass. We don't really know if that's the case, then you could simply crush glass from a broken vase or old tessera. But given the excess of silica in that base glass melt, it seems likely that type 2 would dominate in this context, and you wouldn't see that mixed type signature like the manuscript. Another reason that this two-step process is really nice is that in addition to reducing the time that the yellow pigment is exposed to heat, so preserving the yellow color, this two-step process means that you can make a big batch of transparent base glass in your primary glass workshop, where your furnace is, and then the yellow colorant can be added in a secondary workshop before they remelt the glass to shape it or do whatever they're going to do. And so it's nice to be able to decentralize some of the work going into producing these different colored glasses. And we know that they're aware of the fragility of this color, because as the SEM image earlier showed, they were mixing this crushed anime rather roughly into the glass. So this is just a yellow glass looking at it through an optical microscope, and the dark streaks are where the opacifier are. And you can really visualize that you had this colorless glass, you threw in a handful of the yellow, you mixed it enough so it looked yellow, but you didn't overheat it. And so if the calx is type 1 and the final glass is type 2, perhaps this anime is a mixture of type 1 and type 2. because critically the anima was made with a relatively small amount of silica. And so I think that this solidifies as a mixture of type 1 and type 2. And because the artisans knew that this color was thermally fragile, it would make a lot of practical sense to underfire it rather than underfire it, leave some lead tin yellow type 1, which is, it's still yellow, it's great, instead of risking overfiring and getting a white product. So yeah, if this is the case, then some of this intermediate product for glassmaking could have just been ground up and traded to painters or illuminators to use as a pigment. And I really like this as a nice study of how a detailed look at the materials gives us insight not only to like the materials that they were using, but also the processes and the technologies that were in use by artisans in the past. So we step back from the technical evidence for a moment. It gives us a more nuanced picture of lead tin yellow than I gave you at the start. Its appearance in these Byzantine manuscripts is striking because it's rare, though how much is true rarity and how much is underdocumented or understudied, that's open for debate. But it is the critical study of the specifics of these materials that linked it to the glass industry. And this connection to glass is all the more intriguing if you consider it within the broader Byzantine aesthetic. Those who know far more about Byzantium than I have described that beyond color, it was the ability of materials to reflect, emit, capture light that was really what was valued, because light was really closely tied to and perhaps the manifestation of God, which is why it shows up, these yellow golden colors show up so much in icons. So there's this theology of light. So within this framework, the use of vitreous pigments may have been chosen not only for their color, but also perhaps as an effort to somehow capture the light and bring it onto the page through this material. From a technological perspective, this bridges the gap between pigment and glass production. A very important reminder that these craft spheres were not as separate as we sometimes tend to think that they are. Lead tin yellow was not an isolated 14th century invention, but rather a part of longstanding tradition in manipulating lead and tin silica systems. Venice did. So remember I said it thought to have been originated in Venice in the 14th century. And Venice did have a strong glass industry, but it was also a major trading center. So perhaps the pigment just made its way there, traded from the East, and that the recipes recorded there were more formalizing practices that were already existed elsewhere. So just to wrap up, I hope that I have showed you that lead tin yellow is not merely a medieval or Renaissance pigment, but it is part of this deep technological lineage that goes back to the earliest yellow glasses of antiquity. And objects like this Theoctistos gospel, yeah, they remind us that scientific analysis does more than identifying the materials, but it also helps us reshape some long-held assumptions about how people were working in the past, and recover knowledge about these ancient technologies, and how people were manipulating the materials around them. And yeah, it's cool to connect this to strands of this technological heritage that goes back quite literally thousands of years. So enough for me, but thank you so much for listening. And I especially want to say thank you to all of my colleagues at the Getty and at Caltech, who very graciously invited us into their lab for this work. And this work is ongoing. And I wanted to highlight this chapter by Nancy and Catherine, which reports the initial analysis of the manuscript, but also elaborates on the art historical significance of vitreous pigments in the context of Byzantine art, which I think is very interesting. So if you want to read more, that's there. Yeah, so I would love to take any questions that people might have.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a wonderful talk and very insightful.
Thank you.
Um, while we open up the floor to questions through the Q&A box, I would like to ask one of my own really fast. When you spoke a little bit about the blackening of the art pieces, that had to do with the degradation of the type 1 phase into these other
Mhm.
phases. Could you speak more about what that chemically would look like and structurally would look
The
like? And
darkening, that's a very good point, and it might have been unclear from my part. Type 1 is actually very stable. It's orpiment, the arsenic sulfide that tends to degrade. And so when it's next to other lead-based pigments, not other, but lead-based pigments, lead white is kind of the example people usually use. You get these lead sulfides that form, and it tends to darken and go black with the lead sulfides.
I see. Has anyone ever looked into the time resolution of the degradation into those secondary phases at all?
I'm sure people have. I think even Celia has done some more research on arsenic sulfides. That's not a pigment I'm very familiar with, but it's a very interesting, and a lot of conservation science work goes into understanding the longevity, the light fastness, and the durability of these pigments.
Very true. Wonderful. And one more question as we see a little bit more coming in here. I just lost my question. I was reading someone else's. I'll go ahead and read this one though.
It's all right.
So this anonymous attendee said, excellent presentation with an intriguing story. Can you give us a similar seminar for other colors? For example, blue.
There's so many interesting stories, and I like that they mentioned blue because blue, cobalt blue is perhaps the most famous vitreous pigment, smalt, because cobalt is such a strong color in glassy materials that you need very little of it to get this really rich, opaque, dark blue. And so they would grind it and use it as a pigment, and it was used very widely in European context, but also in Japanese manuscripts. It was all over the place. So there are a lot of, I think every color and a lot of different materials have interesting stories like this that people are actively working on uncovering. And that's part of the reason that I like working on it. And pigments are fun because they remind us kind of how human these materials are. People are looking for colors, they're looking for things that they like. Um, and and blue is certainly one that has a couple different ways of getting there. Um, and yeah, even that fish vessel that I showed earlier, that's cobalt blue, that really dark blue. So yes, there is definitely a story to be told there.
Sure, thank you. Another question from Gibson. You described the type 2 structure as lead tin 1 minus X SiX03. How much does the silicon content change the color or the pigment, or in your experiments with differing silicon content, did you find different amount of silicon doping? Also, were there any modeling experiments like DFT to explore the reaction pathway or formation temperature of the type 1 versus type 2?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. The I put that formula there in that form for this reason because it does vary. It does X in that tends to be around 0.25. But there is quite a bit of variation and it's not really a strict structure. And because there is so much excess, we didn't measure that specifically because it's in this silicate matrix, this lead silica matrix, and there's so much excess silica around that it's hard to separate um, when you're trying to measure those phases specifically and contrast them to the matrix. There has been high temperature XRD study. That's though they were looking at, I think, tin opacified glazes really. They weren't focused on lead stannate. Um, but they did high temperature XRD and like looked at the temperatures at which these different compounds formed, but they were focusing really on the kind of the pathway rather than really dialing down temperatures or conditions under which these form. In that way, this is quite an understudied material, and we could do a lot more to understand the specifics of how these are forming. But it does definitely, even the silica content has an effect on color, but even just how long you fire them, even the type 1 varies quite a bit in color, depending on firing, and whether that's to do with unreacted lead oxide or the combination of Massicot versus Lithard in your lead oxide. It's hard to, you don't get a very well controlled color out of it. I don't have a good summary of how the silica directly affects the color. But that's something that there's definitely scope to do some more to kind of nail down those parameters and how much that changes.
Definitely. Thank you. There is another question from Scott that I can answer myself. It's about accessing these presentations in the future. So all of these webinars from the series, they go to the webinar archive on the ACerS website. So you should be able to access those in the future through the ACerS YouTube archive. And then from Isamara, congratulations for your excellent presentation. What about lead oxide Massicot? I think a book on ours I have studied has lead oxide and tin yellow due to FORS spectra of some points, but I can't do any more analysis.
Okay, yeah, because even though I said Massicot wasn't necessarily intentionally used as a pigment much in antiquity or in art history, it does appear quite a bit, and it especially in this context, it appears with lead tin yellow type 1. It seems that if you were paying attention to the Raman spectra, very rarely did you get lead tin yellow without some of that lead oxide hanging around, whether it is unreacted from the beginning, whether it's started to decompose. If you have any sort of stoichiometric imbalance in your reagents, you're going to end up with some Massicot or litharge in your final product. So it's probably a byproduct of the production of lead tin yellow, that there is just this lead oxide that kind of hangs out with it rather than thinking about it as a separate pigment. It seems quite common when you have lead tin yellow to also have lead oxide showing up in your FORS or your Raman spectra.
Certainly, thank you. Yeah, I would like to add to that about the firing times. It looked like, unless I missed something in the slides, it looked like you chose 3 hours for a lot of your laboratory experiments. What did you try any longer firing times? And if so, what were the color variations? Just more pale? Was it just not as expected?
Yeah. The longest firing that we did was 5 hours. And we did 1, 3, and 5 hours. And we saw quite a bit of change between 1 hour and 3 hours, and quite frankly, not a lot of change between 3 and 5 hours. And so it seems like things kind of had reached some sort of equilibrium around that point. So there was, even at 3 hours or 5 hours, there was still a lot of that white matrix for firing too long. We probably could have and will in the future test even shorter temperatures. You saw just how much, or shorter firing durations. You saw just how much that, like, with those lead antimonate symbols, just even minutes at too high of a temperature, you can lose a lot of color. So it seems like a lot is happening in those early short time frames. But once you hit about 3 hours, not a lot is happening. We also tried one sample that we left in for 8 hours as the furnace cooled down, so kind of giving it time to anneal. That's not quite the right word, but to cool slowly. So we're still playing with those parameters a little bit, but long story short, 3 hours gave us about the same results as 5 hours, and so we we stuck with that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for answering. One more from an anonymous attendee. Thanks for a great talk. It sounds like that early makers, at least those whose pigments ended up in Byzantine manuscript, would have chosen to produce type 1 and then proceed with a second reaction that resulted in the mixed pigment, type 1 and type 2 together. If I understand this, could you speak to why not stick with type 1? Was it due to desiring the color of the mixed product?
That's a great question. And we can never really say why they made these choices, but half the fun is theorizing around about it. So you could use type 1 as a pigment directly. But it seems like if you maybe they wanted that kind of more golden color that you get, maybe they chose it for this connection to the glass industry. They were glass as a material, kind of in light with that desire to capture and trap light. You can think of glass as something where it's a material whose optical properties are well known for transmitting, refracting, reflecting light. So it might have been that they chose that. It might have been that the just the way that the glass makers were making type 1, there was it was integrated into the process a little bit more, and type 2 is where it was available to be shipped off as a pigment. There's any number of reasons, but it does seem like no one is using type 1 alone as a pigment that early. It seems like they are using type 2 or this mixture. So it's a really interesting question to think about why, if you have a yellow pigment, lead yellow type 1, why bother with a second firing? I don't really know. That's a question that I would love to dig into a little bit more.
Certainly. Well, thank you so much for answering these questions. And if no others pop up in the remaining time, I would like to go ahead and thank you again, Sarah. That was a fabulous talk, and I look forward to hopefully seeing more from you in the future. And thank you so
Thank
much,
you
and
so
thank you
much.
everyone who attended. And oh, great. Well, see you next time, everyone.
Thank you so much.